beyond all doubt how cruelly the Turk treats those whom he carries away captive. He treats them like cattle, dragging, towing, driving those that cannot go along, and killing out of hand those that cannot go, whether they are young or old.
What's wrong with that?
But he's saying,
That's a joke. But what the Pope is doing is saying, hey, you nobles, hey, you common people, hey, everything, the bat signal is up, right? Like, do what you have to do to get to Gotham and fight the Joker.
lead the fight against the barbarians.
I resemble that remark.
Islam will continue to be triumphant until there have been 12 Khulafa, all of them from Al-Quraysh.
The God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever.
This is my brother, my executor, and my successor among you, so listen to him and obey.
My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting.
Whoso obeys me obeys God. Whoever disobeys me disobeys God. Whoever disobeys my commander disobeys me.
The Lord said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession.
Two systems of government, two visions for life on earth. Whichever is true changes everything. This is Christ and Khulafa.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Christ and Caliphate. Today, we're going to talk about the Crusades. And I'm going to ask you a couple things to start. Can you define the Crusades for us?
Yeah, so the Crusades have a kind of a broad historical meaning. They were military expeditions ordered by the Catholic Church at various points starting in the late 1000s. There weren't only crusades against Muslims, there were crusades against like Christian schisms as well. But for today's purpose, we're going to be focusing on the Christian crusades against the Muslims, specifically the ones intended to recapture the Holy Land.
And why is this relevant today to be talked about?
So right now we're at this interesting cultural moment, and in internet world, which is often upstream from real life world, people are having conversations about this right now. And what happens is, in the sort of woke world, people want to criticize every single element of Western history. This wasn't a good thing, this was a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And generally, the Crusades are seen as a bad thing in the West and have been looked down upon and have not been something that's popular. Now, in defense against this sort of woke ideology, you have people defending parts of Western history in order to sort of validate this and to sort of argue with people who are trying to destroy Western history and culture. And sometimes in the attempt to do that, mm-hmm. they're sometimes defending things that should not be defended. Mm-hmm. Mm. So I see this somewhat as a reaction. Now, if you're like Roman Catholic and not Pope Francis, making the Crusades this sort of historic good actually makes a lot of sense within the domain of Roman Catholic theology. But if you're not Roman Catholic, if you're Protestant or something else, then this makes less sense. But essentially what people are trying to do is revisit this period in history right now and like defend what's going on, basically. And we are here to try and bring a sort of biblically minded Christian analysis to the Crusades and what Christians should think about the Crusades.
Which, by the way, there were Crusades against Protestants.
Yeah, or at least pre-Protestant
thinkers.
Yeah, Protestant-like thinkers.
Okay.
Like into Bohemia against the Hussites, who were kind of proto-Protestants about 100 years before the Reformation.
100 years, wow.
Okay.
Good to know.
I mean, when you go to Turkey, there is the Hagia Sophia. You know, there's the Topkapi Museum, and there's all kinds of history left over from the Crusades. You know, the Ottomans were there, and then when you go to Israel, there are structures that are just built all around, you know, the Crusades, right? Like in Caesarea Philippi, for instance. When you go, there's on the tours, they'll just show you all of the different things that were constructed and how they were strategically used in the Crusades. So it's a super interesting topic.
So I think one thing that people make a mistake in is this isn't a question of whether the Muslims or the Christians were the good guys and bad guys in this scenario. Mm-hmm. Because I think what often sort of like liberal Western academia likes to do is paint the sort of Islamic civilization as this sort of enlightened modern civilization at the time, and the West is this warmongering colonial power that is attacking otherwise peaceful people. Now, that view of the Crusades is ridiculous, right? And is not true. That does not, however, make the Crusades like a good thing.
Sure. I mean, I think the hard part with all history these days is it's all being viewed through the lens of a narrative, right? Like, how do I interpret history to support my narrative? You know, a lot of progressive people or people on the left, you know, on varying degrees of the left are saying things like all property should revert back to the indigenous peoples. So to me, this is like the indigenous peoples argument. It's all being filtered through the indigenous peoples argument. Like, you know, the Muslims were there, then the evil Christian Crusaders came in and did this and did that. And, you know, I remember my father telling me a story about the Byzantine Empire, right? Like, and when the Hagia Sophia was taken over, I think I told you about this earlier this week, where the Seljuks came in and they were invading, and somebody they hide themselves in the Hagia Sophia, and they're pounding on the doors, right? And everyone's like, "What should we do? What should we do?" And somebody says, "It's the angels. Open the doors." And they open the doors, and they're all slaughtered, right? So my dad was like happy to tell me this story. I look at the story now, and I'm like, first of all, it's probably not true. Second of all, what a horrific thing to have a bunch of people die, right? In the middle of a war like this. But now we look at all wars, right? Like, we're looking at the modern context of war and how things have played out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So let's get it. So, Sophia, did they ever talk about the Crusades in Mexico? Is that like a thing people talk about in school there?
I can't even remember the first time, you know. I mean, don't quote me. Could very much be that I just didn't pay enough attention. But I actually think that I don't remember learning about the Crusades in Mexico. I was in middle school there. But I'm sure they talk about them in school over there. I think the first time I heard about the Crusades was in America. It was in Seattle, at least from a school perspective, in a school environment, was in like high school in Seattle.
All right, it's settled. We are going to review Kingdom of Heaven for the podcast, even though it's 20 years old.
I know, such a great movie, though. Great.
Okay.
The director's cut, though, because apparently that's the best.
Yeah.
Jeremiah on Cultish told us to watch this too.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right.
Cool.
I forgot about that.
We haven't done movie reviews in a while.
Yeah, we've got 2 coming up.
Okay.
So, question. So one thing I've heard is that the Crusades described as defensive wars based on the Islamic conquests. That is legitimately taking Jerusalem back from the Muslims after the Muslims conquered it. What do you think of that argument?
I mean, I don't think that that's accurate, but my grasp of the history behind it is not as probably deep as yours is. So, you know, I tend to maybe I'm looking at it through a modern narrative too, right? Like it's a convenient narrative to blame the other guy from the other side of the fence, you know. So growing up, the narrative I heard was the evil Christians were trying to, you know, like defile the Holy Land, right? So, you know, it depends on what side of the fence you're on and how people are gonna.
I also heard it as a defense, that it was a matter of defense, of self-defense.
From a Christian perspective.
From a, I don't know, from a.
I mean, I went to Catholic school
I didn't
for
go to
5
Catholic
years.
school. Gotcha.
And we did talk about the Crusades
Gotcha.
in 5th grade, right? Like, you know, I think 4th grade or 5th grade social studies or something like that. And we talked about it, and, you know, the way it's framed from the Roman Catholic idea is that it's, I mean, I wasn't Catholic, but you know what I'm saying? Like I'm sitting there hearing
Yeah.
the two sides, right? Like I'd go home and my dad I'd say, "Hey Dad, I learned about this." And then he would tell me the other side
That's interesting.
of, you know, the story from his perspective.
I guess one of the biggest things for me is like, I fail to see, people love talking about the Crusades, but I fail for some reason, but I fail to see how the Crusades, like what happened, how it was uniquely different from any of the other, in this case it was like the Catholic Roman Church. But like, why do we, like, I guess my question is why we, as culturally, focus so much on the Crusades and not on like all the other wars during the different periods of the Roman Empire, and even before that, like way before that. I guess that's a big. And then people also love studying the Crusades, and then of course they love then quoting the in Exodus and in like the Old Testament, the wars against the Canaanites. Like people love connecting those things. I really don't see the connection, but that's a thing that is often brought up as well.
Yeah, I don't know. To answer your question, I'm not sure if it's a just premise or not, right? But I certainly seem to think that people who have an interest or there are sides, right? And people are going to sit there and say, well, they started it.
Like
right?
anything, though, like all other wars.
Well, yeah, sure. But I mean, this is a little different because we're still fighting over that piece of land, right? Like whether or not you want to, that there's the state of Israel, and then there's all the surrounding states, the Islamic states, and then on top of that, there's like foreign interests who are pouring into that area too. So
yeah, people.
It's still and it's still very like a touch point and very reflexive. People get reflexive about it.
Okay, yeah, I guess I can. Yeah, especially
or defensive.
And people want to connect
Palestine.
it to like modern wars in the Middle East as
like
well.
Israel and Palestine.
Well, even before that, not before that, but contemporaneous with that, if we think about like the war on terror.
Oh.
The Muslim, so Osama bin Laden would connect the West to the Crusaders.
Yes.
For example.
Totally.
Okay.
Didn't we do that letter? We did that letter.
Yeah, we did. We did, right?
Letter.
So
letter
he talks
to
about the West being the Crusaders.
Right.
So that's why it's coming up again. And so there are distinct sides in this, but let's go through a timeline of how this actually unfolds. So Jerusalem, which is not the only piece of real estate under dispute here, was in the hands of the Byzantine Empire, which split off from the Western Roman Empire, and the OG Roman Empire was the one that basically annexed Jerusalem. So it was a Roman territory, which later became a Christian empire. So when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in both East and West before it split. So that's about like 378 AD or something.
Still Roman, though.
Yeah, still Roman.
Yeah.
So then there's some wars with the Sassanids, but the Byzantine Roman Empire holds control of Jerusalem in those wars. And then Jerusalem was taken by the Muslims after it being held by the Roman Empire for basically 600 years at this point.
So that one more, the last part, Jerusalem.
Jerusalem was taken by the Muslims, the Muslim Arabs, in 638 AD, after basically 600 years of Roman rule in Jerusalem.
Right. Okay.
Basically. So,
but the Roman Empire is still well in control, flourishing. This is like one of those
No.
not flourishing.
no, so the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, would last for a lot longer. Mm-hmm. But the Western Roman Empire is gone, long gone at this point.
Who's controlling it at this point?
A various group of tribes that have taken over
Okay.
Italy and all the Western lands, but it's gone. There is no Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire fell in, I believe, roughly around 500 AD.
Okay.
So the Western Roman Empire has been gone by 138 years at this point.
That's why, for example, in this case, the Muslim Arabs were able to take Jerusalem.
Well, the Eastern Roman Empire was still very strong.
How?
But the Eastern Roman Empire had just been fighting this long and bitter war with the Persians.
Right.
And because they were both depleted, both of them just kind of folded to the Arab forces very quickly.
I see. Okay.
So then there's lots of iterations of Islamic governments, and the caliphate that conquered Jerusalem is replaced by another caliphate, which is replaced by another caliphate, which grows less and less powerful. Mm-hmm. And in the basically from 999 onwards, you have Seljuk Turks who are coming from Central Asia, and they're taking over all the other Arab countries, but they're Sunni Muslims, and they are attacking both other Sunni Muslims, but also the Fatimid Caliphate, which are Shias, and the Fatimid Caliphate owns Jerusalem at this point.
Okay.
So these Turkish Muslims are at war with other Muslims, but they also start invading what is now Turkey.
So it's kind of the opposite of what we see today, where like Muslim denominations that disagree with each other tend to collide with each other against a couple common enemies. But in this case, it just sounds like one group decided that everybody, other Muslims, other non-Muslims were in the wrong.
It's not even that. They just want the territory. These are Turkish raiders who see an opening.
It's not religious.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so there is some religious justifications to it, but it's really just a power struggle.
Power struggle. Okay.
And so the Abbasid Caliphate accepts the help of the Seljuk Turks, but the Caliphate itself is just a symbolic, figurative power at this point.
Okay.
The real power is in these provincial armies.
Okay.
So then they are taking over the rest of the Middle East, and they're going into Turkey. And it's during this time, in 1026 AD, that these Turks start harassing Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem. So these Muslim nations are allowing Christians to observe their religious rites, but when people raid them or persecute them, they're not doing very much to help the Christian pilgrims. So stories start reaching back to Europe of ways Christian pilgrims are mistreated on their way to Jerusalem. So
I didn't know there were Christian pilgrims going to Jerusalem specifically at this time.
yeah,
But I guess they've been doing that for hundreds of years, thousands of years at this point.
Hundreds of years at that point. Yeah.
At that point.
yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a letter written by Alexios Komnenos, who is the Byzantine emperor, who is writing to a friend in Western Europe. And he says, "The holy places are desecrated and destroyed in countless ways. Noble matrons and their daughters, robbed of everything, are violated one after another like animals. Some of their attackers shamelessly place virgins in front of their own mothers and force them to sing wicked and obscene songs until they have finished having their ways with them. Men of every age and description, boys, youths, old men, nobles, peasants, and what is worse, still yet more distressing, clerics and monks, and woe of unprecedented woes. Even bishops are defiled with the sin of sodomy, and it is now trumpeted abroad that one bishop has succumbed to this abominable sin. Therefore, in the name of God, we implore you to bring this city all the faithful soldiers of Christ. In your coming, you will find your reward in heaven, and if you do not come, God will condemn you." so essentially, he's seeing all these things happen to the pilgrims, and he is asking for help from Western Christians to basically come and defend Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, from this sort of tide of incoming Turks, basically.
There's a lot in here.
Yes. A great deal.
There's a lot in here. But when I read this, it also, like, it doesn't feel like, it just takes me back to, like, I'm not saying this is propaganda, but it just takes me back to wars that use this same language to get other countries, like literally to get other countries to fight. I mean, it reminds me of like the world wars of like, oh, they're doing this and they're killing the babies and they're doing all this. Like, we need to fight against the German, like all that. It just sounds like that similar kind of language. I'm not saying, I'm not questioning the sources, but
it's an appeal to their.
It's an appeal, of course.
To their Christianity.
But this is always like the kinds of things found in these appeals.
I mean, I think it's all true. Honestly.
I'm saying very well.
People are depraved, and war is war. And honestly, this, like, I know that this wasn't. This reminds me of the stories I heard about the Taliban. So, in the 90s. So, yeah, I mean, okay. So where does it leave us, right? So what's the context and?
So then about what are we working with? So that is in the sort of that's in the sort of 1070s. Then in 1095, the European Catholics gathered something called the Council of Clermont. One important thing here about in sort of 1055, something called the Great Schism happens, where the church in the West formally splits from the church in the East over the idea of papal supremacy. So the church in the West believe the Bishop of Rome is the leader of all Christians everywhere, and the church in the East believe that the sort of council of bishops in all these apostolic cities should lead together, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1095, they have the Council of Clermont, and then Pope Urban II. I'll read this in Karl Urban's voice.
Yeah, I was going to say, not to be confused with Karl Urban the First.
Well, I can't actually read this all in his voice, but I'm definitely going to have a graphic of Karl Urban dressed as a pope.
You got to pick one though. You got to pick. Is it the boy's voice? Is it?
Although sons of God, right? You have promised more firmly than ever to keep the peace among yourselves and preserve the rights of the church. There remains still an important work for you to do. Freshly quickened by the divine correction, you must apply the strength of your righteousness to another matter which concerns you as well as God. For your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them aid which has often been promised them. For as the most you have heard, the Turks and Arabs have attacked them and have conquered the territory of Romania, that's the Greek Empire, as far west as the shore of the Mediterranean and of the Hellespont, which is called the Arm of St. George. They have occupied more and more of the lands of those Christians and have overcome them in 7 battles. They have killed and captured many and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. If you permit them to continue thus for a while with impurity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. On this account, I, or rather Lord, beseech you as Christ's heralds to publish this everywhere and to persuade all people everywhere, of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to these Christians and to destroy that vile race from the lands of our friends. I say this to those who are present. It is meant also for those who are absent. Moreover, Christ commands, all who die by the way, whether by land or by sea or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. This I grant them through the power of God, with which I am invested. Oh, what a disgrace if such a despised and base race, which worships demons, should conquer a people which has the faith of an omnipotent God and is made glorious with the name of Christ. With what reproaches will the Lord overwhelm us if you do not aid those who with us profess the Christian religion? Let those who have been accustomed to unjustly wage private warfare against the faithful now go against the infidels and end with victory this war which should have been begun long ago. Let those who for a long time have been robbers now become knights. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians. Let those who have been serving as mercenaries for small pay now obtain the eternal reward. Let those who have been wearing themselves out in both body and soul now work for a double honor. Behold, on this side will be the sorrowful and the poor, on that the rich, on this side the enemies of the Lord, and on that his friends. Let those who go not put off the journey, but rent their lands and collect money for their expenses, and as soon as winter is over and spring comes, let them eagerly set out on the way with God as their guide.
Huzzah! No.
So, so that's the British Navy. What you're looking for is Deus Vult.
I know.
So then, 3 years after this, the armies of the French and the British and the Europeans actually managed to capture Jerusalem from the Fatimid Arabs. So they waged successful battles against the Seljuk Turks, and then they go and capture Jerusalem in 1099 from the Fatimid Caliphate. And that is the timeline.
The Shias.
Yeah, the Shias.
I thought the Sunnis were already taking over.
They were, but they hadn't got Jerusalem yet.
Huh.
So the Seljuks had tried to take Jerusalem from the Fatimids. The Sunnis tried to take it from the Shias, but they were unsuccessful and the Fatimids held it.
Oh.
So it's actually very interesting.
I was going to say, that's a whole other very interesting dynamic going on.
So what do we think? From a Christian perspective, is this a legitimate war, and was the crusade biblically justified?
I mean, my first thoughts reading this, comparing it to, as we already mentioned at the beginning of this, like to our modern day understanding of war as mainly nation states, not as empires, that's like where my brain tends to, but of course it's probably biased with like just living in a different time period of like, this seems very messy because of there's no like division of religion and state like really flushed out. So I don't know. Those are just some initial things that I think about here.
I think it's bogus. I mean, look at what he says, right? Like, hold on. On this account, I, or rather the Lord, beseech you as Christ's heralds to publish us everywhere and persuade all people, whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians and to destroy the vile race from the lands of our friends, right?
Do you object to being called a vile race?
Hey, first of all, you better ask somebody. And then he says, moreover, Christ commands it, and then there's a quote. And is he quoting himself, or is he like he's quoting himself, right? So all who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remissions of sins. I grant them to the power of God, with which I am invested. So, okay. So we're fighting. Listen, just to back out. I zoomed in on the words, but let's back out for a second, right? Like part of me is like it's okay to want to see the kingdom of God like restored, right?
That's
particularly fine. In like the way that they're looking at it, and there's certainly like biblical precedents for it, right? Because the Jews were carried off, right? And then they came back and they built the second temple, and there's this kind of like time of restoration that happens. And if they're using that as a motivation to kind of do it, but it was also not done with soldiers, right? So it's the well, we have power and we have force, and I am the voice of God, so therefore it must be so. And I mean that's not obviously it's not reflective of the scripture, right?
Right. So first of all, this is somebody who is claiming to speak on God's behalf for this.
Right.
That makes him a false prophet.
Right.
I have a question. this is like my main job here is to just clarify. We started by reading the letter from the Emperor Alexios. And this is what, 30 years? Like 30 years before this one from the Pope?
Yeah.
Maybe, about?
Yeah.
From the Pope. So why do they sound so different? Anyway, I guess I'm saying like, after the Pope wrote that the letter that we just read, then that's when the European soldiers were deployed.
I mean,
But they didn't work. It didn't work when the emperor asked for the same thing. He didn't. I guess he wrote it quite differently. Yeah. Anyway, that's just curious. And
who's the letter to, right? So,
I think it's to the Europeans.
It's to a European lord that he's friends with, basically.
all right.
So I think...
Are they writing to the same person?
No.
Who is
So
Alexios writing to?
Alexios is writing to a noble in Western Europe who is his friend, and he's trying to kind of recruit help from Western Europe.
Who is the Pope writing to?
The Pope isn't actually writing. He's giving a speech to kind of like all the leaders of the Christian world, and it's recorded.
In Rome?
Clermont.
Oh, yeah, okay. Which is in...
Pass. Europe.
Okay.
What? There's no Earl of Claremont. There's no Duchess of Claremont.
Claremont, Tennessee.
Yeah,
Claremont, Tennessee.
You listen up, y'all.
So
The Muslims are gone taking Turkey.
So it sounds like the emperor was, as you said,
I laugh so hard.
seeking for help, but the Pope is just giving a like when like when a superhero like gives the call for battle with me, and they all go in and go into battle. This is a battle
Is
speech.
the Pope shining the bat signal?
Versus, the Pope is shining.
Exactly, but he's not going. By the way, he's
Right.
just he's going to sit.
Of
in his-
course not.
Well,
He's
I think you have to look at their roles, right? So
Okay.
the Pope is, the head of the
head honcho.
Right. I mean, he views himself over nations.
Okay.
So one is like a leader of a nation appealing to another, noble person. A noble person appeal to a noble person. But what the Pope is doing is saying, hey, you nobles, hey, you common people, hey, everything, the bat signal is up, right? Like, do what you have to do to get to Gotham and fight the Joker.
Pretty much is what I'm feeling. Yeah.
So there's several.
Or Two-Face.
And he's speaking on behalf. He says to be. Oh, sorry. He says to be speaking on behalf of God, as well, which we already pointed out. And yeah, he's like saying a bunch of stuff. He's saying that they're by not submitting to Pope Urban II, then they're not submitting to God, and then they're gonna get in trouble with God for if they don't do what he's asking them to do lead the fight against the barbarians.
I resemble that remark.
So
yeah, it's interesting.
So I think for me, a lot of my objection to this comes with the sort of ambiguity and false theology behind a lot of these ideas. If this was simply a limited job that the Emperor of Constantinople was asking for help in defending Constantinople, which his letter is, right? Then I see that as a legitimate thing to do, right? That is a legitimate war in self-defense.
Exactly.
I mean, there are tones of this that remind me of the Book of Lamentations, right? Like even the first, letter.
Oh yeah.
This idea that look at the splendid city destroyed, right? Like look at how her nobles are cast in the street. Let's, but there's no the entire focus of Lamentations is we did this, like we fell short, we did this. The reason why we don't have this thing that God gave us is because we have failed, and this is just like. There's no introspection here, right? Like you see what I'm saying? It's just a complete look at the infidels. We have to repel the invaders. We have to repel the barbarians.
This is like the exact opposite of introspection. This is actually so Jesus says.
This is gaslighting.
Yeah, before you.
I know it's like a buzzword. Maybe it's not exactly gaslighting, but it's kind of like
Oh no, gaslighting.
So Jesus says, before you remove the speck from your brother's eye, first remove the plank from your own eye.
Right.
This is what's happening here is the exact opposite of this. So what he's saying, right, is you have been accustomed to unjustly wage private warfare against the faithful. Now do that against the Muslims. You have been robbing and raiding people. Now go fight Muslims and do it there, right? So it's like you guys treat each other like crap already. Can you now please utilize that energy and go treat the Muslims like crap?
Yeah, well,
That's what's happening
That's
here.
what he's
I mean,
saying.
you have to also understand that, like, from a modern, post, like, Reformation way of looking at these things, we look at the forgiveness of sin coming from Christ, right? Like, we believe in Jesus and, he forgives you of your sins. But the way that they're looking at it is, the Pope is capable of forgiving your sins.
Yes.
So he's offering, like, a get out of jail free card.
Yeah.
Right, to
Right,
anyone.
right.
So if you have committed a crime, like
Against-
the Pope says,
Yeah.
you're all good now, just go fight in the war, right? And you come back and whatever.
Rechannel your sins properly.
Which, by the way,
Which is an ends justifies the means.
which by the way is exactly
Philosophy.
what the Islamic conquests are doing early on, right?
Yeah.
Right.
How you can be guaranteed to go to paradise, death and jihad.
Death and
Yeah.
jihad.
Well, I mean,
Same with the Vikings.
yeah. Right. Valhalla.
Valhalla, right?
Yeah.
So, biblically,
I'm sorry. It's
can you guys think of anything, Old Testament or New Testament, which kind of says if you die in battle, you'll go straight to paradise?
okay. Not in battle, but in service of Christ, being martyred for your faith. But it's not. It's not straight, but it's implied that, if you're already serving in relationship with the Lord, you're serving Him, and you die, that you're going to be received into heaven.
Are you thinking New Testament?
But it's it's not like you. It's not like you like. Oh, you know what? I robbed a bank, but and I killed a bunch of people, and I'm not going to change or really accept anything. I'm just going to go do like my penance over here, and in this case, it's
A war.
So let's scrape all the barnacles of tradition off here, right?
Yeah. So the answer is no.
Biblically,
I can't think of anything.
Biblically, what is the way to be guaranteed going straight to paradise?
Calling out to God in the
That's
Old Testament.
It's
In the New
Romans.
Testament, it's
If you believe in your heart, confess with your tongue.
that Christ is the Lord.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. If you confess through the mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved.
Right.
So anybody who trusts God, all those who call on the name of the Lord will be saved, as Romans 10 says.
Right. And the only thing I would add is turn from your sin.
Yeah.
Right.
Right,
Repent.
right. If you
Like
repent-
Peter says in Acts 2, like repent and be back.
Implied in accepting Jesus as a
So if you're
atonement.
looking at biblical Christianity, there is absolutely no room for this type of thinking, because you actually have to construct a system of sins and how we're forgiven from them, which is completely unbiblical.
I think he's kind of drawing from the maybe not intentionally, but like drawing from the idea of Nehemiah. Like this is our birthright. This is our spiritual heritage. And let's go rebuild it, right? But let's go retake it. But again, from a place of force, and also wasn't promised to you. It was promised, they're acting on out of the covenant, right? And on top of that, God's favor is with them when they rebuild the temple. So, when they go out, they're like the leader of the land has said, go ahead, do it, like take your temple back,
But yeah.
rebuild your temple.
Yeah.
So
Basically, no.
yeah, the whole thing is just, I don't know, like not to be repetitious about it, but
So I looked up earlier this week some quotes from Martin Luther on the Crusades, because I'm curious, because, obviously it's easy for us to critique these things with sort of modern sensibilities.
Yeah, exactly.
But Martin Luther was 500 years ago now, and I was interested to see what he'd say about the Crusades. And I think he brings some very interesting clarity. This is Martin Luther, by the way, not Martin Luther King. Just for the millennials watching this.
yeah. The OG Martin Luther.
Yeah, the OG Martin Luther, who MLK was named after. So listen to this. He says, but what motivated me most of all was this. They undertook to fight against the Turk in the name of Christ and taught and incited men to do this, as though our people were an army of Christians against the Turks who were enemies of Christ. This is absolutely contrary to Christ's doctrine and name. This is the greatest of all sins, one that no Turk commits, for Christ's name is used for sin and shame and is thus dishonored. This would be especially so if the Pope and the bishops were involved in the war, for they would bring the greatest shame and dishonor to Christ's name, because they are called to fight against the devil with the word of God and with prayer. And they would be deserting their calling and office to fight with the sword against flesh and blood. They are not commanded to do this. It is forbidden.
Pause there. First thing that comes to my right there is Martin Luther is appealing to the division of church and state.
Yeah.
He's appealing to that straight right off the bat in that part, but keep going.
He's drawing from 1 Peter.
Yeah. He says, if I were a soldier and saw a priest banner in the field or a banner of the cross, even though it was a crucifix, I should run as though the devil were chasing me.
Oh my God.
Even if they won a victory, by God's decree, I should not take any part in the booty or rejoicing.
Wow.
So Martin Luther was categorically against the idea of the Crusades. But now, check out the distinction he does draw here. He says, nevertheless, what the emperor can do for his subjects against the Turk, that he should do, so that even though he cannot entirely prevent the abomination, he may yet try to protect and rescue his subjects by checking the Turk and holding him off. To this protection, the emperor should be moved not only by his bounden duty, his office in the commandment of God, nor only by the unchristian vile government that the Turk brings in, as has been said above, but also by the misery and wretchedness that comes to his subjects. They know better than I, beyond all doubt, how cruelly the Turk treats those whom he carries away captive. He treats them like cattle, dragging, towing, driving those that cannot go along, and killing out of hand those that cannot go, whether they are young or old.
What's wrong with that?
But he's saying...
That's a joke.
Before you keep going, so here he's saying this is proper for the emperor to do. This is not proper for the bishops to do.
Right.
Okay, keep going.
So the emperor, the person defending the land who has the responsibility for that, should do something. And the church should not do
Church
something,
should
right?
be praying and other things.
Right. They have different weapons for a different war.
Keep going,
It says, in the first place, if there is to be a war against the Turk, it should be fought at the emperor's command, under his banner and in his name. Then everyone can assure his own conscience that he is obeying the ordinance of God, since we know that the emperor is our true overlord and head, and he who obeys him in such case obeys God also, while he who disobeys him disobeys God also. If he dies in this obedience, he dies in a good state, and if he has previously repented and believes on Christ, he is saved.
This is an interesting point.
So he's, again, kind of refuting this idea of if you die in battle against the Turk, you go straight to paradise. He says, look, if you die when you're saved, you're saved.
Believing in Jesus. He's also saying that he's not quoting the Bible here, but is this a quote, and the way a Christian reading this can maybe recognize that he's appealing to Romans, where it says, like, submit to the rulers over you. I mean, Jesus says, to Caesar pay what is Caesar's.
Right.
Is that the kind of, we can maybe extrapolate that
It's actually really interesting in base
underlying
terms, because a lot of Christians throughout history have been like, I'm not joining the army, right? Like, I'm not serving because I can't take another life. What's it, Hacksaw Ridge, right? It's a movie about that kind of thing. So, but it's all drawing from 1 Peter, where Peter talks about, the authorities being given the sword. Paul talks about it too in Romans.
I mean, it's interesting because before we keep on reading, if he further explains, if you just stop reading where we are, he's saying the bishops cannot save you from your sin. Like, the bishops are not the voice of God. But then paragraphs down, he's saying, no, the emperor is the overlord, and if you obey him, you obey God. So he's almost giving the emperor if we stop reading just there without any underlying knowledge of the Bible, if you just stop there, he's giving the emperor the authority that he's not giving the bishops or the bishop or the pope.
Right. And so this is not an
What's going on there?
Yeah. So let's finish the quote here, because that will help us.
Okay.
In the second place, this banner and obedience of the emperor ought to be true and simple. The emperor should seek nothing else than to simply perform the work and duty of his office, which is to protect his subjects. And those under his banner should seek simply the work and duty of obedience. By this simplicity, you should understand that there is to be no fighting of the Turk for the reasons for which the emperors and princes have hitherto been urged to war, such as the winning of great honor, glory, or wealth, the increasing of lands, or wrath, or revengefulness, and the other things of the kind. For these things make men seek in their own self-interest, and therefore we have no good fortune heretofore, either in fighting or planning to fight against the Turk. So when he's saying obey the emperor as God, he's not talking about an unlimited obedience there.
Right.
He's talking about
A simple obedience.
a simple obedience within the parameters of the role that God has given to the civic leaders.
Right.
So the Emperor of Constantinople from earlier in the story has every right and duty to be defending his lands from
The Turks.
from the Turks. And if Christians from Western Europe had gone and helped defend Turkey from the Turks, I guess Asia Minor is what we're calling it. I'm gonna start referring to your kids as Asia Minors.
I mean, they got it from me. So you can refer. I'm a minor from I was a minor from Asia at one point.
Yes. So there'd be, I think you could probably make the argument that there'd be legitimacy in doing that. But then this idea of reclaiming Jerusalem from people that weren't even invading them,
Right.
is non sequitur to that.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's an interesting thought. I don't necessarily buy it from either. The hard part about like this whole thing is that there are people mistreating other people, right? I kind of see a parallel today. So what we would do as Americans, right? And it hasn't happened recently, but if there was an American citizen being held captive or prisoner by another group, that the American government would go to great lengths to get the person out,
Yeah.
and in some cases use force, right? So
Yeah.
it kind of depends on who's president or what channels are going on or whatever. But it just happened. So there are Americans being held in Gaza, right? And
One of them died.
one of them died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was murdered.
Yeah, one of them was executed. So, regardless of whatever you feel about Israel or Gaza, we're looking at it from the standpoint of like, that's our person, and I believe rightly so. There should be some like, why didn't we go get our person, right? Or why didn't we go to that we still have people in Afghanistan? Like, why don't we go into Afghanistan and get our people? Why don't we go to these different places and go get them? And right now it's like a political football. Brittany Griner is a WNBA player, and she got arrested in Russia for bringing marijuana into the country, right? Like, that was a big deal, and they worked for her release. So sometimes it's diplomatically, sometimes you have to send in, SEAL Team 6. But I'm sympathetic to that, right? Like, I'm completely sympathetic to that as a person who is an American citizen, right? Like, nobody wants to see their citizens die abroad, particularly if they're innocent. You know what I mean? They're not like they're not spies or whatever. And I mean, that's like another old trick, right? Like, oh, you're spies, So they do it in Turkey all the time. People go in and do missions work, and they're like, oh, you're trying to destabilize the government, and they throw them in jail. There are American pastors in jail in Turkey right now for that kind of thing, So the onus is on the leadership to go do that. Would I try and organize a strike team myself? Well, first of all, we don't. it would not work very well to go and do that. So the burden is on them, and I think rightly so. You know, I think the church should support that, right? But not take the step into like making it, you know, like bring our people back. Let pray for the government, right? Pray that they're wise. Pray that they're making good decisions. Pray that they're using good strategy, and that the last thing they would want to do is take a life, right? In getting our people back.
Or in just defending their people.
Right. So there's a legitimate scope of the state, and if you and a Christian in good conscience can pray for that, can support that, can even be on the strike team.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
I was just gonna say I would even more rather if there was a writing out there from a soldier who wasn't just a whatever British, French, or like Roman, whatever, that was called themselves like a Christian, like saved by Christ. Like I wonder what they from that time, like how they would feel and what they would think in this situation.
You don't even have to even go back to that. I mean, like if you go back and read I know we're talking about the Crusades.
Yeah,
right?
the Crusades.
The soldier's mindset, like in a conflict like this, you can see in the Civil War, right? The American Civil War. You know, Christians fighting against Christians, and you know having to obey, and you know what I mean.
But like, I mean somebody who would say like, I am saved by in faith alone by Jesus, not by how well of a duty, I hit this again, not by how well of a duty I perform to the emperor or to the
Well, I don't think this is a pervasive attitude at the time, right? Like the Reformation hadn't happened yet, or it just happened, or
no, this is
like Wittenberg.
This is still 400 years before the Reformation.
Yeah, so you know, I don't think that
there were true believers amidst all of this.
Sure, but I mean,
probably super confused.
I'm saying that it's not common that you would find people like there's always a remnant for sure, but I don't think it's common that you would find like a ton of people who are thinking outside of the Pope's box.
Right. Except in the East.
Okay, yeah, right. But they're not in this conversation.
You're saying they don't they're not able to be soldiers. I don't know. It's all very interesting.
So they don't have a ton of choice, but it's like I'm less concerned about the exact salvation mechanics of like an actual Crusader soldier, and more of like how we learn from this, right? And I think how I kind of want to land this is God has appointed governments. There is legitimate case of defense, of protecting your citizens, and there's all sorts of scope for that, which is going to change based on time and place and circumstances, with a contingent on wisdom and all things like that. But the church and the state have a different role in this. Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, my servants would be fighting so they'll not be delivered over to you. But my kingdom is not of this world. Meaning the cause of Jesus in the world does not advance through violence.
So to the people, okay.
Now, so a government is given the sword, right? The Romans tells us that. But we have to understand there's limited value for that. The world's problems are mitigated through states using force, but they're not solved through that, right? The transformation of hearts and minds necessary to make the world better doesn't come at the point of a gun.
Yeah. And I mean, it's important to consider the words, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, right? So, you know, if you're a Christian and you choose the sword, you walk into that paradigm, right? Like, but, you know, better to observe the commandment, not to kill.
And it also just shows, like, how, like, because at this point, the empire is Christian. It's Roman Catholic. Mm-hmm. But it just goes to show how, an empire or a nation or a country can call itself, we're under this religion, and then say that all of their actions are based off of, we see that today in America, but it just goes to show that, and that's what Martin Luther also kind of makes a point of, is that true faith, and how people express that faith isn't you can't assess that by like just saying, oh look, here are the Catholic people of God, like people, you can't just, and which is what the Pope is trying to say, is like, oh, this soldier, these, the British, the French, the all of us, we are God's children. We are doing God's wars. We're fulfilling God's purposes. And like the Romans did that, and like people do that now in America, like Republicans, liberal Democrats, like they all say it. They're like, oh, we're fulfilling God's true purposes in this war or not in this war. And so like just it's good to see that this has been a recurring theme that has always happened. And what Luther is saying, those that are saved by putting their faith in Jesus. That's that. So like we must like Martin Luther isn't happy about the people that are like saying it's in the name of God, or the leaders that are saying that it's in the name of God, and we shouldn't do that.
And one thing, this is a podcast called Christ and Caliphate, not Caliphate and Christ. So we're going to be looking at it from the Christian
perspective,
from a Christian perspective. But you better believe that people on the other side were like, we are trying to protect this land, right? Like
the Muslims.
We're trying to expel infidels. You know what I mean?
Of course.
Like we're trying to keep everything sacrosanct. So yeah, I mean,
right.
It's it's unfortunate. It's a common theme, but I think if you're looking at like religious wars, my gut is like, no, well, religious wars are bad, but Christians are certainly called to like serve in the military. Mm-hmm. Right? I know plenty of Christians who are in the military. I know Christians who have seen combat duty in Iraq and Afghanistan and different places, and lost other Christian brothers in those things. And the world looks at them now and like, well, why were you in Afghanistan? Right? Like it's a lot like what happened in Vietnam. They come back. Mm-hmm. It's not as bad in my opinion, but you come back and now what wants to happen is this very like, you killed people in a foreign land because you were the oppressor. You're the oppressor. You acted on behalf of that, and mm-hmm. it's this thing that Martin Luther is saying. Yeah. It's like in obedience to your
government.
Right, but I mean, when you're a soldier, you take an oath to do that.
Right, which you're free to do, but it's not the same thing as the cause of Christ, right?
Right.
In the same way, you being a husband and a father protecting your family is not directly the cause of Christ, mm-hmm. but it is still, something that Christ wants you to do, allows you to do. So I want to close with one last Martin Luther quote. Mm-hmm. It says, "Let the Turk believe and live as he will, just as one lets the papacy, the Catholics, and other false Christians live. The emperor's sword has nothing to do with the faith. It belongs to the physical, worldly things. If God is not to become angry with us, if we pervert his order and throw it into confusion, he too becomes perverse and throws us into confusion and all misfortune. As it is written, with the perverse there are perverse. We can perceive and grasp this by means of the fortune we have heretofore had against the Turk. Think of all the heartbreak and misery that have been caused by the Crusades, by the indulgences and the crusading taxes, with which Christians have been stirred up to take the sword and fight the Turk, when they ought to have been fighting the devil and unbelief with the word and with prayer."
Right.
Guys, thank you for listening to Christ and Caliphate. We'll be back next time.